First of all, welcome everyone to this presentation. Good afternoon. I appreciate you taking your lunch hour and spending that time with us. Like you, we are all watching the next steps that are going on with the next round, the fourth round of affordable housing. There have been significant changes. We are all connected to this in some way or another. We have a group of panelists here to present their perspectives and knowledge of where we are and where this program is going. We have Brad and Diane from Mariziti Falcon, attorneys at law. Brad will be giving us some background on the program as it existed and its initiation all the way through the current fourth round, and what we're looking at from an affordable housing program driver. That's the foundation, and a lot of us have some understanding of that. Diane will then begin to talk to us about what the ramifications are on this significant amount of housing as it relates to providing drinking water and sewer service for these. Obviously, in order to have this housing in place, we need to provide the necessary infrastructure. It's not as easy as we all think. And quite frankly, it's an afterthought that we're dealing with. Steve Donati, my partner at CP Engineers, will be also talking about those same concepts, the challenges facing various communities and municipalities in terms of getting adequate water supply, drinking water, and adequate sewer service, the costs associated with it, the timeframes that are associated with it, and the regulatory hurdles that will need to be addressed. So let's kick it off with Brad, who will provide us with the background on the fourth round housing and how we got here. Brad?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brad Carney. I'm a partner at the firm of Mariziti Falcon. On March 20th of this year, Governor Murphy signed into law Bill S50A4, which amends the New Jersey Fair Housing Act and states that municipalities. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you move to the next few? Thank you. That slide is fine. And states that municipalities in compliance with the Fair Housing Act will also be in compliance with the Mount Laurel Doctrine, which is the state's constitutional requirement that every town provide its fair share of affordable housing. Next slide, please. The Mount Laurel Doctrine is a judicial doctrine that reads into the New Jersey State Constitution a requirement that municipalities, through their land use regulations, provide a realistic opportunity for the production of their affordable housing obligation. The name itself comes from two cases. One is commonly referred to as Mount Laurel 1, decided by our Supreme Court in 1975, which applied that constitutional obligation only to developing municipalities. And later on, there was another court case that said that only a good faith effort needed to be made to achieve that. When none of that worked, the case came back to the Supreme Court, and the Mount Laurel 2 determined that that constitutional obligation must be provided by all municipalities. Mount Laurel 2 importantly introduced the builder's remedy, which led to a flood of builder's remedy litigation. In 1985, the legislature responded with the statute, the New Jersey Fair Housing Act, to establish reasonable fair share guidelines, and it created the Council on Affordable Housing. That act was actually challenged and was determined by our New Jersey Supreme Court to be constitutional in 1986. That's commonly referred to as Mount Laurel 3. Next slide, please. The Council on Affordable Housing adopted round 1 and round 2 and round 3 regulations. Round 1 was 1987 to 93. Round 2 was 93 to 1999. COA was late in its round 3 obligations, adopted them in 2004, again in 2008. That introduced the concept of growth share, which was invalidated by our Supreme Court in 2013. And then when COA failed to adopt round 3 regulations in accordance with the Supreme Court's guidelines, the Supreme Court transferred all of COA's tasks back to the courts in 2015. That case that you see on the slide is commonly referred to as Mount Laurel 4. In the new law, the legislature has come up with a plan to make affordable housing consistent with the State Development and Redevelopment Plan. That is important because the State Planning Act also was introduced in tandem around the same time in the early 80s. Next slide, please. Next slide. The deadlines created by the statute, one has already been accomplished. On October 18th, the Department of Community Affairs came out with its fourth round, both present and prospective need obligations for the next 10-year cycle, which starts on July 1st of next year and runs through June 30th of 2035. This panel is focusing on the prospective need calculation that was determined by the state, and we'll leave the present need for a later discussion. The next important deadline is that on January 31st, municipalities are supposed to adopt a binding resolution as to their present and prospective fair share obligation. Importantly, that resolution is basically just stating that the calculation is correct. It's not necessarily the time to put in vacant land adjustments to that calculation. That can all be done before June 30th, when the municipality is supposed to adopt its housing plan element and fair share plan and its draft ordinances. So that's an important distinction to note, because I imagine that municipalities will be taking advantage of the vacant land use adjustment. That does not need to be determined by January 31st. Next slide, please. In the new law, however, there are more chances to lose immunity to builder's remedy litigation. So, for example, failure to comply with all the deadlines or any one of the deadlines, it can result in a loss of immunity. And also introduced in the statute is a new concept called the compliance certification, which will replace the judgment of compliance and repose. Next slide. So DCA's fourth round affordable housing report is based on, it goes back to what we call the Jacobson methodology, but in the statute, it is basically taking the census data from 2010, comparing to the census data of 2020 for households. The U.S. Census Bureau defines households in two categories, family and non-family. Next slide, please. What the Department of Community Affairs did in its report is it looked at the difference in households between 2020 2010, and then multiplied that by 40% or divided by 2.5 to come up with the prospective regional need, which is for round 4, the prospective need of affordable housing units is 84,698 units. Next slide, please. That regional prospective need obligation has been broken down into the 6 housing regions, and you can see there on the slide what the expectation is for each of the housing regions in terms of new units to satisfy the round 4 prospective need. Next slide. Appendix A to that report, DCA's October 18th, 2024 report, includes the prospective need calculation then for each of the 564 municipalities in the state of New Jersey. It is important to note, though, that there is a cap. No one obligation will exceed 1,000 units, or if the prospective need as a percentage of households is more than 20%, it will be the lesser of those two numbers. And so you do see adjustments already in the Appendix A to that report as to each municipal fourth round prospective need. Next slide, please. There is objections, however, to this methodology. For example, the Affordable Housing Committee that was part of the New Jersey Institute of Local Government Attorneys has proposed a different methodology. In fact, has proposed an amendment to what Governor Murphy signed into law, which is not to base it on households, but rather to base it on certificates of occupancy. And I'm just going to summarize the second bullet point there. That's basically what they're trying to do is establish the prospective need for affordable housing units based on residential housing units that were actually constructed over the prior 10-year period. And that has been proposed as an amendment to the legislation. If that were to be adopted into law, and I'm not sure what the likelihood of that actually would be, it would actually reduce the fourth round prospective need obligation anywhere between 65.4% for Region 6, all the way to a reduction of 82.8% for Region 2. And overall, for the regional need, it would be a reduction of about 78% of the fourth round prospective need obligation. Next slide, please. Importantly, now that I've given you this background is, well, what are the solutions in terms of being able to actually reach this very aggressive goal of the fourth round prospective need. It's important to note that the Department of Community Affairs did not take into, and I don't think even the legislation takes into account, whether or not there's sufficient sewer and water capacity available to achieve the fourth round prospective needs. And my opinion is that I think that the local redevelopment and housing law is going to be extremely important in the fourth round, not only because buildable land, at least in northern New Jersey, is becoming scarce, and the redevelopment law can be utilized in terms of correcting blight with affordable housing obligations, but it also allows you to enter into a redevelopment agreement that can help defray the costs of infrastructure costs, which I'm going to go through next. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to spend really any time on the criteria individually. That could be an entire afternoon session by itself, because there's case law that addresses each and every one of these redevelopment criteria, including although there is a new one regarding vacancies in criteria B, which probably will be challenged as to what that even means. But I just want to point out with this is not every piece of land qualifies for an area in need of redevelopment. So it's a planning obligation, usually done by a municipal planner, to do a report, preliminary investigation, to see whether or not one or more of these criteria would apply to a proposed area to perhaps be declared in need of redevelopment. You can go through the next couple slides. Next one. I'm sorry, back up. So if an area is determined to be in need of redevelopment, it's done by way of resolution. The next step then is a redevelopment plan, which really acts as your zoning plan for the redevelopment area. That's an ordinance adoption procedure. There's either two ways to do it. Either the planning board can prepare the plan and then transmit it to the governing body for adoption, or the governing body can prepare the plan, submit it to the planning board for its review, consistency with the master plan, its recommendations before it comes back for ordinance adoption. Next slide. When those two things have occurred, an area in need of redevelopment has been declared and a redevelopment plan has been adopted, then the legislature has delegated a variety of powers to the municipality. And the one power that I'm just going to focus on for the purposes of our presentation today is it allows the municipality to enter into a redevelopment agreement for the undertaking of any project or redevelopment work. And this is the important part: negotiate and collect revenues from a redeveloper to defray the costs of the redevelopment entity. Usually it's the governing body. There could be a redevelopment agency, including where applicable, the costs incurred in conjunction with bonds, notes, and other obligations. And I will say that our firm has been engaged with the redevelopment process and has negotiated redevelopment agreements on behalf of a municipal client whereby the sewer plant needed to be upgraded to increase capacity for the plant. And we put into those redevelopment agreements, pursuant to this redevelopment power, a mathematical formula to defray the costs of that plant, not to pay entirely for the entire upgrade of the sewer treatment plant, but to have the redeveloper pay its, what I'm going to call its fair share of that cost based on the projected sewer allocation needed for the project, as well as the anticipated growth or increase in plant capacity. And so the redevelopment law is a powerful tool in that sense, because it's not bound by that strict restriction, the municipal land use law of the pro rata share. And perhaps even more important than that, of course, is the pilot, the payment in lieu of taxes, which there's a limitation actually as to how you get to a long-term financial agreement or a payment in lieu of taxes. Redevelopment law allows that to happen. And we have also, on behalf of some municipal clients, in those pilot agreements, we were able to, I'm going to call it, lack for a better phrase, front load the first 10 years with money that could be used for public purposes, such as defraying, again, the costs of infrastructure and also paying for other other public needs. And so at this moment, and I know I've gone through this very quickly, and I will be open for questions at the end, but I'm now going to turn this over to Stan, who can talk about a little bit about environmental and water infrastructure limiting factors.
Thank you, Brad. And I think that last slide that you were focused on really is impactful. The notion that the redevelopment process really has a new value, and it's been used extensively throughout New Jersey for years, but this fourth round of affordable housing is going to really reach out to it and find ways to utilize it to help municipalities, authorities, and the developers providing that housing. So Brad provided a good foundation in terms of why we're here, what we're talking about, and it's the fourth round, an obligation for some 85,000 units of affordable housing. DCA did come out with this report, the methodology and background report for the fourth round. And what they did do, and I want to recognize the hard work that was done by a variety of people, they did take into consideration environmental factors that limit the ability of certain areas to be able to provide for new development. Clearly, a planning area 1 metropolitan is very different than a rural or environmental sensitive area 4 and 5, and weighting factors differ with respect to them. So too, if there are centers, if there are areas like the Pinelands, the Meadowlands, the Highlands preservation areas, these factored into how DCA came up with the numbers on the basis of the overall categorization of the planning area. Next slide, please. In addition, when DCA looked at undeveloped land within the various municipalities, they did look at land use or land cover considerations, utilizing their GIS platform. And this was important to recognize that the numbers needed to have been adjusted to reflect the reality of the developability of these properties, considering state restrictions, local restrictions, environmental goals, and the like. So I'm going to give 2 checks so far in terms of a tremendous effort that was done. Let's go to the next slide, please. The struggle I had, though, is when I looked at DCA's methodology and background report, and I evaluated it relative to consideration of adequate drinking water or adequate sewer service to be able to support that development. What I found was interesting. There's only 4 times the word water was even utilized within the background and methodology report. Twice it was used in the context of the Highlands Water Protection and Planning Council, the word water. The other 2 times, it was referred to as a Category 1 waterways and wetlands development restriction, and the 4th time referring to open waters in the context of development restrictions. The bottom line is that the availability or the current capacity and future development of drinking water supplies and sewer service areas was not addressed. This was probably something that DCA took into consideration. That's a municipal issue, it's a regional authority issue, it's a developer's issue. And while that is true, it is managed by the municipalities, the authorities, and the developer whose property they're trying to develop. If it hasn't been planned out ahead of time, and if it hasn't been thought through ahead of time, the cost and time considerations are going to be enormous. Brad went through the timeline associated with 2025 and the work that needs to be done. Brad identified that the goal was to achieve this affordable housing, according to DCA, was over the course of the next 10 years. And that this new legislative effort was intended to streamline the process so that we can get to the building of housing and not the planning for or the regulatory applications for housing. How that has not been addressed at this point. So as we go forward, that will be a challenge that's in front of us. Diane and Steve are going to talk about some of the very specific challenges that developers, municipalities, and regional water and wastewater authorities are going to have to deal with in order for this affordable housing to become a reality. Diane? You're
Thank you,
on mute.
Stan.
Yeah, okay.
Good to see all of you today. I'm going to talk about identifying and conveying infrastructure needs. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, a significant number of treatment plants were planned for, designed, and constructed. At that time, planners took a look at a 20-year planning horizon and developed build-out values based upon the projected demand within a confined sewer service area. And those values were incorporated into, not so fast, Lorena. Those values were incorporated into an Egypti's permit. And that the Egypti's permit is designed so that the wastewater will be adequately treated to protect human health and the environment. Due to water-saving devices, land conservation measures, and other things that reduce the demand from the sewer service area, we've extended that planning horizon. But now we are finally coming to the end, and these affordable housing requirements are going to present new challenges for us. Nope, stay there. Very good. Based upon, the desire to make sure that treatment plants do not get overextended, the DEP adopted the capacity assurance program, which is designed to assure that capacity is available and is planned for, and what happens when it gets used up. The first part of the capacity assurance program is planning. When a treatment plant reaches 95% of its permitted capacity, it needs to submit a capacity analysis report to the DEP. And I think Lorena was going to send you a link to the capacity analysis report and the planning provisions, so you can take a look at that yourself. But what that's designed to do is to review measures and implement what they can to maximize capacity and reduce flows, including I&I infiltration and inflow reduction, so that the effluent limits in the NGIPT's permit are always met. At some point, we're going to run out of capacity at the treatment plant. And that is determined based upon a 3-month consecutive period. If you violate your permit limits, the sewage treatment plant needs to institute a self-imposed sewer ban. If the sewer authority thinks it could violate its NGIPT's effluent limits with the introduction of new flow, it also must institute a sewer ban. And there are procedures for that, which are available at the link provided. If the municipality or the sewage authority does not impose a sewer ban, DEP can stop issuing TWAs. At this point, or prior to this point, the sewage authority needs to identify its treatability limitations using hydraulic modeling, treatability studies. It can try to address treatability limitations through pretreatment requirements imposed upon its high-strength users, or through process modifications or modifications to the treatment plant. But it's imperative that the sewage treatment plant talk to the municipalities and member municipalities so that they are aware of the constraints inherent in the system as they have it and the costs that will be associated with moving to the next step and increasing treatment plant capacity. Next slide. Another component of the capacity assurance program, and what many people forget, is the conveyance system. Also, you are required to have adequate conveyance capacity in the sewer lines themselves. In the downstream sewers, the peak dry weather flow can't exceed 80% of the depth of the pipe, and during peak wet weather flows can't result in any sewage leaving the system, any sewer overflows. There's also regulations with regard to pump stations, but you can look at those regulations. I think they're listed at NJAC 714A-1.2, the definition section. Next. Right. The way the sewer systems were laid out, initially we planned to pick up all the development that existed. You know, high strength users were typically tied into the system, such as schools and industrial areas. And, you know, over time, we have added a house, right? And sometimes adding the houses downstream affect the ability to add users upstream. When the sewer conveyance system was laid out, it is largely based upon gravity, if possible. And that requires that little pipes feed bigger pipes until you get to an interceptor and get to the sewage treatment plant. So there is limited capacity in the hinterlands. And even a house close to the sewer may become overloaded in the event that there's too much capacity in either the feeder collection system or the actual interceptor itself. Next. So now when we want to add to our perfectly well-functioning system a large development in the middle of the system, we may or may not have sufficient downstream capacity. And when we want to add to our hinterlands, where the pipes are smaller, a significant amount of analysis needs to be undertaken in order to develop it. That will result in violations of the regulations regarding adequate conveyance capacity. Some things to do with regard to establishing this is model your system in order to ensure where adequate available conveyance capacity exists. Don't just rely on default factors. There may or may not be things that can be done. They may or may not be very expensive to do. You may be able to get away with collection system lining. Sewer pipe replacements are costly, depending upon how long a run you have to replace. And also, we've seen parallel interceptors and parallel pipes be installed to create more capacity. But the important thing is to develop the costs and convey these costs to your municipalities, because not yet. Because if you plan properly or differently, you may be able to minimize or reduce these costs based upon realizing where your bottlenecks are and trying to avoid them. Okay, next slide. So what can we do with regard to these costs, which can seem very significant? That says development agreement, but you know, clip art being clip art, developers agreements, a perfect place to start. We want to make sure that in our developer agreements, we talk about costs, we allocate costs. There's a limitation in municipal land use law, which I think Lorraine is going to send you a link to, which limits off-track improvement costs to the pro rata share. But you know, otherwise these developers are going to have to wait until a municipality or sewage authority can bond for and implement these modifications. And that could be a very long time. And developers may be able to assist with the financing and work out an arrangement where they get paid back as others connect to the system. Next slide. So it's important that we consider settlement agreements, consent agreements, all kinds of other agreements. One particular agreement that is used in this context, next slide, is a cost sharing agreement. One thing I want to note is that make sure that there's a duration limitation in these agreements so that you don't allocate capacity forever. Consider capacity buyback provisions, both in your ordinances and in these agreements. Another thing that we see frequently is private sewer lines and pump stations. These provide headaches for many areas because they become abandoned. So make sure that all of that is planned for. And now I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Okay, thanks, Diane, and good afternoon, everybody. So, you know, from an engineering perspective, I think it's really incomprehensible if the state didn't consider water and sewer issues in this legislation. When you think about it, when a developer considers a area or a property to develop, one of the first things, if not the first thing that they look at, is the availability of water and sewer. It's such a critical piece of the puzzle, right? It's from both timing perspective and cost perspective. So first question is there public water and sewer available? And then if not, can water and sewer be created on site based on all the environmental and regulatory constraints? And is that economically feasible, right? So that's a big thing. So, and then even where public water and sewer are available, the next step for a developer is to get a will serve letter from the utility or the town, because that's an actual commitment to say, yes, we can serve you. Because as Diane was discussing, you know, just because the utility is there doesn't mean they're going to have the capacity to serve that property. So very important. So to not consider that is just, again, so, you know, not believable. So we'll start with with potable water. Two major metrics, right? Firm capacity. And these are the big buzzwords in the water industry: firm capacity and water allocation. Firm capacity relates to infrastructure, kind of what Diane was just talking about with the sewer system. It's the ability of the water system to serve, you know, serve the needs. But the caveat is with the largest pumping system or treatment system out of service. So that's a very limited thing and very regulated by DEP. And when you think about it, so when you have to increase firm capacity, you might have to add a whole treatment, which again, in any kind of system, but especially in a larger system, can be really costly. So it's one thing. The other metric is that water allocation, which is, it relates to maximum amount of water that can be withdrawn. And it's on a peak factor. So, and that's authorized by permit, and it's highly regulated, and it's hard to come by. So if it's there, it's fine. If you need to create it or expand it, very difficult. So what DEP does is every time there's a new application, you know, for development, they'll do an analysis to see if the utility is in deficit or surplus, and they call it a system supply capacity analysis. And basically, it's water allocation limit minus what the projected flow is going to be, peak flow from this development. And actually, if DEP has really good information on their website, and Lorraine will put the link up there, you should look it up. You know, for a particular system, you might be surprised at where your system sits, because it's, you know, the way they look at it is different than you might think. You know, in my experience, there aren't many systems with surplus water. Everybody is kind of on the edge. So any, these increases that Brad talked about in units are gonna have a huge impact. And again, anytime you have to increase or change those things, it's a major undertaking, time-wise and cost-wise. Next slide. So let's talk about potable water sources, right? One of two. It's either surface water, which are reservoirs and streams, or groundwater, which is wells. Unlike the western states where water availability is always at front of mind, the Northeast tends to take water for granted. In New Jersey, it rains a lot. It's been pouring for 3 days here in northern Jersey. And we drive by water all the time. There's rivers along the road, and you're passing reservoirs. So it looks like there's a lot of water around. But based on the population density in New Jersey, all that water is accounted for, in DEP parlance, allocated. It's all allocated. So a perfect example of the limited supply is this recent drought, right? So we had a relatively short period of minimal rain, but it happened during a historically dry period, which is the fall. You don't usually get a lot of rain. And it didn't happen during a peak usage period like the midsummer or late spring, but still it wreaked havoc on the water supply. Look at the things that happened. Reservoirs dry, wells were beginning to go dry. Thank God the rain started to pick up now, so we're recovering. But it just shows you how we are right on the edge there with our water supplies. And I can tell you when this stuff happens, I know from past years, DEP takes extra notice that, these things are happening. So when you go and ask for a allocation increase, they're going to really interpret the regulations strictly because it's a concern, and get panic. Next slide. Just to build, Diane did a great job of discussing the wastewater. Just to build on what she said, a little bit of the constraints. Development of an expansion of a sewer service area got a whole lot of regulatory hurdles, right? So it's first is a consistency determination. Is the project consistent with the area-wide water quality management? In many cases, it's not going to be because the last rule change, which I think was around 2010 or so, DEP took away most sewer service areas that weren't actually being sewered at that time. So back in the day, as Diane said, back in the 80s, these areas were created, but they were pulled out during this most recent review. So it's a good chance that areas that you think might be sewerable are not correctly. So if you're not consistent, you have to get a wastewater management plan amendment. And that's something that can take years. And there's no guarantees there because things like endangered species get considered and pulled in. And endangered species can kill a site, no doubt about it. We've had all types of issues with that in the past. Amazing stuff. So again, no guarantees there. There's also, in the case of surface water discharges, there's a really important law about receiving water anti-degradation. Basically, that law says, you cannot add any more pollutant load to a stream since it was designated, right? So that means if you have to expand the capacity or the flow of treatment plant, you have to increase the level of treatment accordingly so that the total pollutant load remains the same. So you're treating more, you're treating it to a higher level. It's all good, but for a surface water treatment plant, that can cost tens of millions of dollars easy. These are big projects. So that's a big concern. There's also, Diane talked about the infrastructure, there's extensions, even beyond pipe size, there's pump stations that need upgrade. There's a whole lot of pure utility issues. Then there's also the environmental constraints, which can be really surprising when you go to upgrade a treatment plant. So even when it's designated by DEP that you need to upgrade your treatment plant or whatever, when you go to do that and you find out that these treatment plants were all built in the low areas so that you could get gravity feed, and also in the parts of town that weren't always the most valuable lands, which are usually the wetlands, right? So these things are located in highly environmentally constrained areas. When you go to permit these upgrades, you can really run into some serious issues and roadblocks there. And whether or not DEP or the state require these changes does not matter. Those permits are looked at individually, and there's nobody gets a break for trying to do the right thing. So big consideration. I will say that one thing we haven't talked about too much here is in situations where public water and sewer do not exist, and there are many in this case, right? Because this development is projected all over the place. It gets the costs to develop now and permit and build can be astronomical. So as a quick example, a development of just 100 3-bedroom units, which is a relatively small development here, will generate about 30,000 gallons of wastewater. The cost to design, permit, and build on-site wastewater facility for development like that can easily be between $5 and $10 million. So if you do the math, even on the low end of that, you're talking about $50,000 per unit, and that's just for sewer. Water can be very similar. So big considerations that again, it's hard to believe that this wasn't thought about in legislation. Next slide, just to summarize quickly some of the things that Diane and I both talked about. On the water side, you have allocation issues. You have infrastructure limitations. And another thing that we've all been hearing about is about aging and deteriorating infrastructure. That's going to come to play in here too, because there's capacity issues, but then there's also aging condition issues, which are going to add to the complication here and the cost. Surface water treatment costs are astronomical. So anytime you're dealing with surface water, a lot of treatment involved. There's saltwater intrusion along the coast area, so that water is not really accessible. There's a lot of contaminated aquifers in the state. So that, again, there's treatment. We've all been hearing about PFAS, and that's a whole, treatment issue. That's only one constituent. There's a lot of aquifers with a whole lot of issues that need to be dealt with. And many more we talked about. And then on the wastewater side, you have the sewer bans that Diane's discussed. You have DEP restricts interbasin transfers. It's very hard to take water from one subbasin and discharge it in another. So that creates a lot of limitations too on what can and can't be done. There's the anti-degradation policies that we discussed. There's the pay, conveyance capacity discussed, and then all the environmental constraints. So there's a lot of stuff working against us. And again, I think one of the biggest, there's two big hurdles here. There's the regulatory, which results in time, and then there's the cost. Got it.
We do have some questions from some folks, so would this be a good time to ask some of those questions?
Yeah, yes.
Okay,
Yeah, you're
perfect.
on mute.
Oh,
Am I
sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute.
Okay,
Before we get to the questions, I just want to double back and ask the panelists a couple of things to highlight, because there were some impact numbers that were put out there that I think are very significant. Steve, you just gave an illustration. 100 3-bedroom units for a sewer service alone is somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 to $10 million. That's a $50,000 per unit cost on top of the cost of the basic development, land development, construction, etc. We're talking about affordable housing here. So we've got affordable housing costs that are being suppressed with the market rate units absorbing that differential cost. The same would hold true here. So what we're really talking about as well is some of these costs associated with infrastructure, drinking water and sewer, is going to elevate the cost of some of this new housing stock. Certainly on the market side, the question is, where does the price point go for the affordable housing? But someone's got to pay that tab. It's either going to get paid through the cost of purchase, or it's going to get paid through the cost of the utility, connection fees, and user fees over the course of time, considering that somebody needs to bond it and pay for this infrastructure. So I thought that was very impactful. The other number that I want to come back to is, Brad, you put out a number of 85,000 units of housing. And I know that came from the analysis that DCA did. But if we look at 85,000 units of housing, I think what you said was that was roughly a 40% offset of the total housing units that are being produced. So we're not just talking about 85,000 units of housing. That's the affordable housing piece. It's 85,000 units of housing plus a much larger component of market rate housing. Is that correct?
Yeah, I just want to say that what DCA did is they just applied the statutory formula. It's just math. And when you do the math, when you look at the U.S. Census data for New Jersey for households in 2020, and you subtract that from 2010, you get a growth. And then the formula required that be divided by 2.5, which is the same thing as multiplying it by 40%. And when you do that, you come up with that number of approximately 85,000 units. That was known actually at the time the statute was signed into law. DCA merely took that, came up with the regional obligation for the entire state, and then takes it to the next steps. And those next steps are to divide it down by the 6 housing regions in the state of New Jersey. And then I encourage everybody to go to DCA's website. You can download their report from October 18th. And it lists by county, every municipality, and what their calculated present need is and what their calculated 4th round prospective need is. And that none of those numbers take into consideration the lack of sewer availability or water availability. Right. In some cases, we're not saying obviously that every municipality doesn't have enough capacity. Some do, but some don't.
But in terms of these numbers, Brad, the $85,000 target, which is currently in print, if you use that 40% set aside, that there's an additional 297, let's call it 300,000 market rate units. So we're talking about, I'm sorry, 212,000. We're talking about 300,000 new housing units over the next decade. And do you know off the top of your head what was approximately the number of COs, certificate of occupancies, that were issued in the last decade?
Well, again, I believe the Affordable Housing Committee from the New Jersey Government of Legislative Affairs came up with a number that's close to 100,000 residential certificates of occupancy that were listed in the last, or that were issued in the last 10 years.
Right.
And what that Affordable Housing Committee is proposing in their proposed amendment to the legislation is not based on 40%. It's based on 20%. So they're taking the difference, taking 20%. I assume they're using 20% because that's the builder's remedy, right? 20%
Right.
affordable housing is the minimum on the builder's remedy that came out of Mount Laurel 2. And the program that's established by the new legislation is there to, it's basically there to tell municipalities that they have immunity or they don't have immunity. And emergency regulations have yet to come out. They'll be coming out, I think, at the end of this year. And that will, and also the statute does set forth the procedure for challenges to, so say, for example, a municipality adopts their binding resolution at the end of January, but it's a different number. It's not the number that DCA came up with. Fair share housing, other third parties have the ability to challenge that. Similarly, the deadline at the end of June for municipalities to adopt their housing plan element and fair share plan plus their draft ordinances. If that's not done in accordance with the statute, there's a time period in which that can also be challenged by third parties, primarily fair share housing. And that all goes to the program for resolution. So it's all set up there. So it used to be you would get a judgment of compliance and repose. You're all done. You're now protected from builders' remedy lawsuits because you have that immunity. This statute, in my opinion, weakens that immunity because there are many more opportunities for that to be challenged. And it's a certificate of compliance now that is being issued. And just because the municipality has a certificate of compliance, if they're not meeting their obligation going forward, I imagine the program will yank that certificate of compliance
Right,
away.
right.
So more opportunities there.
Well,
Perhaps
it's
the
gonna,
board's remedy,
it's gonna be a
but-
wild ride. 2025 is gonna be a wild ride. Buckle up. We've got deadlines, we've got numbers to meet, seemingly challenging numbers. 300,000 units of housing in the next 10 years. We've only done 100,000 in the last 10, so I'm not sure what we're gonna do differently going forward to achieve these lofty goals. We have the same water, wastewater restrictions today that we have had. But let me pivot, because there are a couple of questions from the.
Dan, if I could just say
Yep.
one thing, there's probably much more residential housing needed than that, because we're only talking about the prospective need. There is also the present need obligation.
Right.
And then there's also the unmet need. So the unmet need came about primarily because towns would take vacant land adjustments. And that created a so-called unmet need. So
That even,
I know it's a lot to
reinforces the
talk
point.
about. We only have a few minutes left.
Yeah, that reinforces the point even further. So there was a question that related to redevelopment. Can you very briefly address whether or not eminent domain fits into redevelopment, and if so, where and when?
It's a great question. So, yes. So, in the redevelopment law, in the context, we have to, it's very careful, you have to be very careful, and you have to distinguish between condemnation redevelopment areas and non-condemnation redevelopment areas. And there is a case called Harrison versus DeRose that required what I call a super notice that has to go out when you are going to designate an area as a condemnation redevelopment area. And if that notice is not sent out, it allows the property owners in the redevelopment area to raise as an affirmative defense as to whether or not any future condemnation that may come down the road there, as to whether or not those bona fide negotiations were conducted in good faith. And it allows them, the affirmative defense, to actually challenge the underlying redevelopment area designation. And so the short answer is yes, condemnation absolutely does come into play. It has not really been used much at all, I think, since the Galenton decision, as well as the Harrison DeRose decision, probably going back to, say, 2008. You don't see condemnation as much. I don't think it is encouraged as much as it used to be in the past. And certainly if you're going to go through a condemnation redevelopment designation, it's very important that you pay attention to what the case law has to say about that, and procedurally make sure you don't make any mistakes, because otherwise it will upend your goal if there is a successful challenge to the ultimate area designation by a property owner as an affirmative defense in a condemnation.
Yeah, and I would say a lot of credit, I think, goes to, legal professionals, the municipalities who are engaged in this process, the developers. Redevelopment, I know, has been a very important tool over the last 10 or more years. The need to exercise eminent domain has not presented itself because there have been solutions that you guys have been able to come up with. And I think the important element that you raised earlier, there are times that redevelopment is appropriate, and given the fourth round, it may even be more appropriate going forward, because it will give the municipalities the opportunity to allocate the fair share of responsibility for these infrastructure, and possibly front load some of those dollars to allow the regional authorities and the municipalities to defray those costs that are coming up.
Yeah, I just quickly want to distinguish between a developer's agreement that Diane was talking about and a redeveloper's agreement that I'm talking about under the
Right.
local redevelopment housing law, because so once you have the area designation redevelopment plan, there's a bunch of powers that go to the municipality. By the way, one of those is condemnation if you're condemnation redevelopment area. But in the power to negotiate redevelopment agreements, it includes that provision to defray costs for the issuance of bonds. And typically when there's a treatment plant upgrade, it's tens of millions of dollars. Bonds are going to be issued. And under the power of that redevelopment law, you can put into your redevelopment agreements, like we have done with certain one of our clients. We have put in a formula there so that, and I'm not talking about the municipal land use law pro rata share formula. I'm talking about a formula that was come up with, that was negotiated, put in the redevelopment agreement, and the redeveloper, and we have a payment plan in there. It's not one lump sum payment for the redeveloper to defray the municipal costs that would otherwise be spread amongst all of the ratepayers to pay for that needed infrastructure upgrade.
And I would imagine that this process of redevelopment also gives life to projects for developers that might otherwise not be feasible. So it really becomes a win-win-win situation that we strive for. So there's another question that relates to, depending upon where you are in the state, you may be in an area that's 100% sewered. You may be in an area where there are no sewers, and the municipality relies on individual septic systems throughout the municipality. Maybe Diane and Steve, maybe if you guys can talk a little bit about a municipality that's facing these challenges. If it's a municipality that's primarily on septic, they might have a few small treatment plants for some small developments, yet they have an affordable housing obligation, and there will be a demand for sewer and drinking water, because these are not things you can deal with your typical individual house well or your individual septic system. What is that municipality going to have to face, and how do they approach that?
Well, Steve did touch on how much it would cost for the individual project to come up with water and sewer. For a municipality, they can extend the sewer service to that area. We'd have to go through all the things that Steve talked about in order to do that, which could take years and lots of money. It could be assessed as a local improvement to that area. We've seen that done. If it doesn't benefit everyone, it can be assessed as a local improvement. But the area would have to be appraised. It's limited to the change in value. So the municipality would pick up the balance of that. It gets very complicated when you try and extend sewers to a new area.
Yeah, that's why I think that's a great question, because that's one of my biggest concerns with this thing are those kind of towns, because they're developing from scratch. And so you're talking about long periods of time and a lot of money. And then, one cost, and Stan, you hinted to it, but you didn't really get into it when you talked about cost, is there's also an operation cost. So, in a lot of these, so when we've developed water, we would develop, say, sewer from scratch in a municipality. When you take into account debt payments and operation and maintenance, you have annual operating costs per user of $1,200 to $1,500 per unit. It doesn't work well with affordable housing, so I'm not sure how that gets taken care of, but there's definitely,
So Steve, I'm going to cut you off there because we're getting to the end of our hour, and I want to respect everyone's time, but there's a lot more that can be discussed with regard to that. The one other thing I want to say, there were a couple of questions that came up, and I know that in preparing for this webinar, we talked about it. DCA came up with a methodology document. We've got DEP, who regulates the process. There's the Highlands Act that also regulates development. We're in a state with multiple policies seemingly in conflict. Part of the project is to resolve those issues. For those that had questions that we could not answer or that will come up, Lorena, do the attendees get our email addresses, or was it just on screen?
I actually put it on the chat, but we can also make sure that on the follow-up email that they get all your contact
Good.
information.
Appreciate that.
Okay.
Feel free to reach out if there's a question we haven't adequately addressed. And I thank you for spending your lunch hour with us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Bob.